Imagine a world where courage was not an emotion, but a profession. Where boys were not told bedtime stories, but taught how to march into death without fear. This is not fantasy, was the Spartan way. The people of Sparta believed that perfection was not found in living long, but in dying well. Their greatest victory wasn't survival, it was glory through death. And in 480 BC, at Thermopylae, they proved that a small band of men, trained to die perfectly, could halt the mightiest empire on earth. Before we go further, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we dive into the strange, the brutal, and the genius moments that shaped human history. From the moment a Spartan boy was born, his life was not his own. He belonged to the state. Weak infants were abandoned, left to die on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. The city believed mercy would weaken the bloodline. Only those strong enough to survive deserved to stand in the phalanx. At 7 years old, boys entered the agoge, the state's brutal education system. There were no mothers, no fathers, only the instructors and the whip. They were taught silence, endurance, obedience, and above all, the sacred duty of death. In the agoged, comfort was a sin. They learned to steal food, but were punished only if caught, not for stealing, but for failing to do it perfectly. They learned to fight barefoot, to endure pain without flinching, to sleep on reeds they had to cut themselves. Each boy was stripped of softness. They were molded not into individuals, but into living weapons, extensions of Sparta's will. By the time they were 12, they could kill with a dagger and track in silence through the dark. By 20, they were soldiers of the phalanx, the most disciplined and feared formation in the ancient world. The Spartan phalanx was not just a military unit, it was a psychological weapon. Soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, spears thrusting in rhythmic unison. There was no room for panic or pride. One man's fear could destroy the wall, and so fear itself had to die first. To be a Spartan meant to train not only the body, but the mind to extinguish every trace of hesitation. The enemy could see it in their eyes before battle. No tremor, no doubt, no wasted movement. This unity was so precise that even death was rehearsed. A Spartan warrior's education was not about survival, it was about dying correctly. The phrase, "come back with your shield," or "on it," wasn't poetry, it was law. Returning alive without a shield meant you had dropped it to flee. Such a man was worse than a corpse. He was dishonored itself. The shield protected the man next to you, not yourself. To lose it meant betraying the phalanx, betraying Sparta, so mothers would hand their sons their shields before war, not with tears, but with pride. At Thermopylae, this code was tested. King Leonidas led 300 Spartans and a few thousand allies to defend the narrow pass. Against them stood the Persian army, some say over 100,000 strong. The Persians were not just numerous, they were confident. They believed sheer size would crush resistance. But what they faced was something they could not understand, men who were not afraid to die. The Spartans had been preparing for this moment since childhood. For them, the battlefield was not a place of fear. It was the stage upon which they could perform their final, perfect act. When the Persians demanded surrender, Leonidas reportedly answered with 2 words, "Molin lab," meaning come and take them. It wasn't bravado, it was clarity. The Spartans did not see resistance as hopeless. They saw it as inevitable. The moment they stood in that pass, they had already accepted death. This acceptance gave them power no weapon could match. On the first day of battle, the Persians charged in waves. The Spartans held formation, their shields absorbing arrows and blows. The phalanx moved like one living creature, breathing and striking in rhythm. Every man knew his role. Every movement was drilled into muscle memory, and when one fell, another stepped seamlessly into his place. Herodotus wrote that the Persians lost so many men that Xerxes leaped from his throne in anger 3 times during the fight. The Spartans' mastery of discipline, born from decades of pain and conditioning, had turned their small number into an unbreakable wall of flesh and bronze. But beneath the clash of spears and shields, there was something deeper happening, psychological war. The Persians could not comprehend why men would fight so calmly, so joyfully, in the face of certain death. They were used to enemies who begged, who fled, who broke. Yet the Spartans laughed. They sang war songs. They stood shoulder to shoulder, as if marching in a festival parade, not a slaughter. This was the perfection. They were trained for not to survive, but to meet death without flinching. Leonidas himself led from the front. He did not bark orders from behind. He fought, bled, and fell among his men. Each Spartan saw his king die the way they were trained to die, with serenity. When the final day came and the Persians surrounded them, the Spartans broke their spears, drew their short swords, and fought until every man fell. They didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They performed their deaths as they had been taught since childhood. It's tempting to see this as madness, but for the Spartans, it was logic. To them, the greatest tragedy was not dying. It was failing to live up to the code. Death was not an end, but the moment their lifelong training reached completion. To die without fear, in perfect unity, was to achieve the Greek ideal of excellence. In this way, Thermopylae wasn't a defeat. It was the purest expression of Spartan identity. Their sacrifice gave Greece time to rally, but more than that, it left a mark on the psyche of the world. Even Xerxes, who crushed them under sheer numbers, could not erase what he saw. He ordered the bodies of Leonidas and his men mutilated, not out of spite, but out of fear. He wanted to destroy the symbol that terrified his army, the proof that mortal men could face death without trembling, but symbols cannot be killed. The story of the 300 spread through Greece like wildfire. It ignited a belief that courage and discipline could defeat any empire. The Spartans were not gods. They were human beings who had stripped away everything human that made them weak, fear, doubt, ego, and replaced it with purpose. That purpose was simple: to die well. Every cut, every scar, every broken bone in their training had served one function: to prepare them for the final test of Thermopylae. In the end, they succeeded. They died exactly as they had trained, perfectly. Their perfection wasn't measured in victory or territory, but in the unshakable calm of their final moments. For them, death wasn't an interruption, it was the graduation ceremony of a life lived by the code. So the next time someone mentions Spartan bravery, remember, it wasn't instinct or luck. It was discipline honed from birth. They were trained to die perfectly, and in doing so, they created a story that no empire, no matter how vast, could erase. And if you've made it this far, that means you, too, have stepped into the mind of a Spartan for a moment, feeling the weight of their code and the fire of their resolve to keep diving into history's most brutal and brilliant minds. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. What comes next is even more terrifying: the sound that made the Persian army tremble before a single sword was drawn. The phrase "return with your shield" or "on it" was more than a battle cry. It was the very soul of Sparta condensed into one Lena mother's final words to her son before he went to war, a command that carried the full weight of Spartan identity. In Sparta, a soldier's shield wasn't just a piece of armor. It represented his duty to the phalanx, the tightly formed wall of men who fought as one. To lose your shield was to break formation, to expose your brothers to death. That single act, in the eyes of every Spartan, was unforgivable. When a Spartan mother handed her son his shield before battle, she wasn't just giving him a weapon, she was giving him the expectation that he would uphold the honor of his lineage and his city-state. Every word in that ultimatum carried centuries of cultural weight. Return with your shield meant victory. It meant you had held the line, stood your ground, and done your part. Or on it meant death with honor. It meant you had fought until the end and been carried home upon your shield as a hero. There was no middle ground. To return without it was the mark of a coward, a betrayal not only of the army, but of the Spartan code itself. The shield was sacred for a reason. Other pieces of armor, helmets, breastplates, greaves, protected only the man wearing them, but the shield protected the soldier beside you. It was the bond that held the phalanx together. Each man's survival depended on the discipline and courage of the one next to him. If a single Spartan broke rank or fled, the wall would collapse, and the entire unit could be destroyed. The shield, therefore, symbolized collective duty over personal safety. It represented the idea that the state came before the individual, and that the strength of Sparta rested not on one warrior's might, but on the unity of the line. At Thermopylae, this philosophy was tested like never before. 300 Spartans under King Leonidas stood against a Persian army that outnumbered them by hundreds of thousands. They knew they were walking into certain death, yet they marched without hesitation. Their shields gleamed in the morning light as they took their positions at the narrow pass. For 3 days, they held the line, their formation unbroken even as waves of Persian soldiers crashed against them. The sound of bronze meeting flesh echoed through the gorge, a rhythm of defiance that stunned the enemy. The Spartans fought shoulder to shoulder, each man trusting his shield to cover the left side of the man beside him. There was no room for ego, no room for hesitation. The discipline drilled into them from childhood took over. They didn't fight as individuals, but as a single breathing organism. The moment one shield faltered, another filled its place. Even when Leonidas himself fell, his men did not scatter. They tightened their ranks and kept fighting until the last man. When the Persians finally overran the pass, every Spartan had fulfilled the ultimatum. They either returned with their shield or on it. To understand why that code held such power, you have to understand how a Spartan was raised. From the age of 7, boys entered the Agoj, the brutal state-run training system that turned them into soldiers. They were taught endurance, obedience, and above all, loyalty to the phalanx. Individualism was beaten out of them. Cowardice was punished with disgrace, so severe that even their families would turn their backs. If a soldier ever threw down his shield and fled, he would be shunned upon returning home. He would not be allowed to join in public meals. No one would speak to him. Women would refuse to marry him. In a society where honor was life itself, such a man was already dead. Spartan women played a central role in preserving this standard. They were known for their fierce pride and blunt speech. When a soldier's wife or mother said, "Return with your shield," or "on it," she wasn't expressing coldness, she was reminding him of his purpose. To her, the worst thing a man could do was survive without honor. There are recorded instances where mothers mocked their sons who returned from battle alive but without their shields. They were not celebrated survivors. They were walking symbols of shame. This mindset shaped every Spartan battlefield decision. Unlike other Greek city-states that sometimes allowed tactical retreat, Sparta did not entertain that possibility. To run from battle was to admit defeat before the fight was finished. The Spartan discipline was not built on speed or cunning, it was built on unwavering endurance. They were trained to hold the line until the last breath. Even their armor and weapons were designed around this philosophy. Their shields were large, circular, and heavy, made of wood and bronze, covering the body from chin to knee. They were designed not for individual duels, but for maintaining formation. The very construction of Spartan warfare revolved around the idea of collective strength. Imagine standing in that phalanx, hearing the sound of arrows slicing through the air, feeling the ground shake beneath thousands of advancing feet. Fear is instinctive. The body wants to flee. But in the Spartan system, fear was confronted with conditioning. From boyhood, soldiers were told that pain, hunger, and death were temporary, but shame lasted forever. That belief created warriors who didn't fight for survival, they fought for meaning. The ultimatum also carried psychological power. By removing the option of retreat, the Spartans removed hesitation. Once the mind accepts that death is possible, but dishonor is not, clarity takes its place. Every decision becomes simple. Fight until you can't. This clarity is what made the Spartan line so unbreakable. Their enemies could not comprehend men who fought without any thought of escape. It wasn't madness, it was purpose forged into instinct. Even in death, the shield held symbolic value. When a Spartan fell, his body was laid upon his shield for the journey home. It became both cradle and kofina, final mark of dignity. To be carried on, it was the highest honor. It meant you had fulfilled your oath. You had upheld the phalanx. You had not abandoned your brothers. You had lived on died as a true Spartan. This mindset extended far beyond the battlefield. It shaped how Spartans viewed every aspect of life. Their society taught that the needs of the community outweighed those of the individual. Every Spartan, from king to farmer, was part of a living shield wall that protected the city-state. Their entire culture was built on that principle of mutual reliance. The shield was more than armor, it was identity, duty, and pride all bound together in one object. Modern people might struggle to understand this kind of absolute thinking. We live in an age that prizes comfort, safety, and self-preservation. But to a Spartan, survival meant nothing without honor. Their mothers didn't raise them to live long, they raised them to live right. Return with your shield, or on it wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. It stripped away excuses and forced men to face the truth that courage is a choice made every moment in the heat of fear. The phrase echoes through history because it captures something timeless, the idea that integrity means holding the line. even when everything in you wants to run. Whether that line is a battlefield, a moral stand, or a personal trial, the principle remains the same. The shield is whatever keeps you aligned with your purpose. To throw it away is to surrender your identity. At Thermopylae, the Spartans didn't win the battle in the traditional sense, but they achieved something far greater. Their stand became immortal. They showed the world that the measure of a warrior is not in how long he lives, but in how firmly he holds his ground. The ultimatum of the shield was not a death sentence, it was a declaration that honor is stronger than fear, and for the Spartans, that was the only victory that ever truly mattered. By the third day at Thermopylae, the air was thick with ash and blood. The sea winds carried the smell of death down the narrow pass, and the clanging of shields echoed between the mountains like thunder trapped in a cage. King Leonidas stood with what remained of his army, 300 Spartans, a few hundred Thespians, and a small band of Thebans. They all knew what was coming. There was no miracle rescue, no secret escape route, and no way out. The Persians had found the path through the mountains that would allow them to surround the Greeks. What the world saw as the moment Sparta met its doom, Leonidas saw as the final move in a greater plan. Before we continue, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we uncover the brutal genius behind history's most legendary moments. The betrayal came from a local Greek named Ephialtes. Hungry for Persian gold, he revealed to Xerxes a hidden mountain trail that bypassed the Spartan position. With this information, the Persian Immortal Zen elite force of 10,000 began their silent march through the darkness, climbing the narrow goat path to outflank Leonidas. When the scouts returned to camp with the grim news, the Spartan king didn't flinch. He didn't curse the gods or despair. He smiled slightly, because he knew this was how it was always meant to end. Leonidas had planned for death from the moment he chose to march north. The 300 Spartans who followed him were not picked for their size or speed, but for something far more important. They were fathers. Each had a son old enough to carry on his name. The message was clear. This mission was not about survival, but about sacrifice. The men who marched with Leonidas were the seed of a legend, not the army of a victory. When the betrayal came, Leonidas saw it not as defeat, but as confirmation that the gods had given them their moment to die perfectly and to turn that path into strategy. As the Persian army prepared its final assault, Leonidas called his allies together. He released most of the Greek contingents, telling them to retreat and prepare for the next battle. The Spartans, Thespians, and Thebans stayed. For the Thespians, it was a choice made out of loyalty and love for Greece. For the Spartans, it was duty. For the Thebans, it was compulsion. They were forced to remain distrusted by Leonidas, but kept as proof of their allegiance. The line was drawn. Those who stayed would not live through the day, but their stand was not futile. It was strategic. Leonidas knew that every hour his men delayed Xerxes' army was another hour for the Greek fleet and ground forces to regroup, reinforce, and organize the defense of the rest of Greece. The narrow pass at Thermopylae was the key to the entire region. By holding it even one day longer, the Spartans would buy time that could not be purchased with gold, only with blood. It was time enough for the Athenians to prepare their navy and for the other Greek states to rally their troops. Every moment of resistance shifted the balance of power, inch by inch. That morning, as the Persian army advanced from both sides, Leonidas gathered his men and spoke to them simply. There were no speeches of glory or divine favor. There was no promise of heaven or reward. He reminded them that their deaths were not in vain. "Eat well," he told them, "for tonight we dine in Hades." It wasn't bravado, it was practicality. He was preparing them to face death calmly, the same way they had trained since childhood. Their fear was already gone. What remained was purpose. When the Persians charged, the Spartans met them with iron discipline. Shields locked, spears thrusting in precise rhythm, the phalanx became an immovable wall of bronze. The Persian front lines fell again and again, their corpses piling so high that the narrow path turned into a mound of blood and armor. Even as the immortals closed in from behind, the Spartans didn't break formation. They turned, adjusted, and kept fighting, facing death from both directions without retreating a single step. The noise of battle was deafening, the crack of shields, the hiss of arrows, the cries of dying men. Yet, amid the chaos, the Spartans fought in silence, their movements mechanical, almost ritualistic. They were not just defending a pass, they were performing a final act of war that would echo for millennia. The Persians couldn't understand it. Why fight when defeat was certain? Why die when surrender was an option? But that question was the heart of the Spartan strategy. The purpose wasn't to win, it was to show the world what it meant to fight for freedom without fear. Leonidas himself fought in the front line. He killed wave after wave of Persian soldiers, his spear finally breaking from use. Then he drew his sword and kept fighting until he was pierced by countless arrows. Even as his body fell, the Spartans fought around him to recover it. They refused to let the Persians desecrate their king. 3 times the Persians were repelled before Leonidas' body was finally taken. When it was, Xerxes ordered his head cut off and placed on a stake. To the Persians, it was a warning. To the Greeks, it was a beacon. The image of Leonidas' sacrifice would travel faster than any messenger. The Thespians and Spartans fought until their last breath. When their spears shattered, they used their swords. When their swords broke, they used their hands and teeth. They died not in chaos, but in formation. Even as the Persians surrounded them, there was no collapse, no Panagonly, an unbroken wall of defiance. The earth beneath Thermopylae was soaked with blood, but not one Spartan surrendered. When the dust settled, thousands of Persians lay dead around a few hundred Greeks. It was an annihilation in miniature, but a victory of meaning. The delay caused by that final stand was crucial. It allowed the Greeks to regroup and set the stage for the victories that would follow, most notably at Salamis, where the Greek navy, led by Themistocles, crushed the Persian fleet. Xerxes' invasion faltered, and his massive army eventually retreated. The freedom of Greece was preserved, and the foundation of Western civilization survived because 300 men and their allies chose to die at the right moment, in the right place, for the right reason. Leonidas' strategy was not about numbers, it was about narrative. He understood something few generals ever grasp, that death can be weaponized when it serves an idea. The Persians won the ground, but they lost the moral war. They returned home with a hollow victory, while the Greeks gained unity and resolve. The sacrifice at Thermopylae became a story, and stories outlast empires. It taught the Greeks that courage was stronger than fear, that freedom required sacrifice, and that one stand could ignite a civilization. Even Xerxes himself could not erase what he witnessed. His army, shaken by the memory of the Spartans' unbroken will, began to doubt its invincibility. The invader became haunted by the image of men who fought with no hope of survival, yet showed no fear. Leonidas had transformed the psychology of the war. The Persians may have walked through the pass, but they walked over the ashes of their own confidence. Thermopylae was never meant to be a battle won by swords. It was meant to be a story written in blood, designed to echo across centuries. Leonidas had turned his men into symbols, living, breathing monuments of resistance. Their deaths weren't wasted, they were invested. The time they bought changed the course of history. And so, what many called a futile standoff was, in truth, a masterpiece of strategy. The Spartans' final day was not the end, it was the beginning of Greece's ultimate victory. Their sacrifice didn't just stop an army, it inspired a civilization. If you've made it this far, you've just stood at the narrow pass with Leonidas and seen what true strategic genius looks like, not in survival, but in sacrifice. To keep exploring how small moments of defiance change the world, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. The next part will reveal how one terrifying sound turned that defiance into legend. Xerxes I, the King of Kings, stood upon a throne overlooking the narrow pass of Thermopylae and believed he was witnessing a formality. He commanded one of the largest armies the world had ever seen, a force so vast that, according to ancient accounts, its soldiers drank rivers dry and its horses trampled fields into dust. His fleet stretched across the horizon. His banners fluttered like storm clouds. To him, the Greek defenders, no more than a few thousand men, including only 300 Spartans, were an inconvenience. He expected fear. He expected retreat. What he received instead was defiance that shattered his understanding of war, pride, and power itself. Xerxes was raised to believe he was divine, chosen by Ahura Mazda to rule the world. Every nation he encountered had fallen before him. Babylon, Egypt, Lydia, absorbed into his empire. His word was law, and his victories seemed inevitable. He had inherited his father Darius's dream of conquering Greece, not merely as expansion, but as vengeance for the humiliating defeat at Marathon. So, when reports reached him that a small force of Greeks stood blocking the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae, he saw it not as a challenge, but as an insult. In his eyes, it was arrogance for so few to resist the will of the great king. The pass of Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, was no ordinary battlefield. It was a natural bottleneck, a place where the mountains pressed against the sea, leaving only a narrow path wide enough for a few men to fight side by side. Leonidas chose it deliberately. He knew that in open battle numbers would crush him. But in this narrow throat of land, the advantage of the Persian army's size disappeared. For all his might, Xerxes had walked into a trap laid not with weapons, but with understanding. When Xerxes first arrived, he sent messengers to demand that the Greeks lay down their arms. Leonidas's response was simple: "Come and take them." It was not a boast, it was a statement of fact. Xerxes interpreted this as suicidal pride. He thought it laughable that a small band of men could defy an empire. He offered them a final chance to surrender, promising wealth and power if they bent the knee. The Spartans refused. To them, obedience to their code meant more than life itself. Xerxes mistook that loyalty for foolishness, a fatal misjudgment that would cost him thousands of soldiers. The first wave he sent against the Greeks was composed of Medes and Scythians lightly, armored troops known for their speed and agility. Xerxes expected them to sweep through the defenders like wind through reeds, but as soon as they reached the Spartan wall of shields, they met an impenetrable force. The Greeks fought in tight phalanx formation, shields locked, spears thrusting in unison. Each Spartan's left arm covered his brother's side, forming a living wall of bronze. The Persians attacked with cries and chaos. The Spartans responded with silence and precision. The narrow terrain neutralized the Persians' advantage in numbers. They could not surround the Greeks, could not use their cavalry, could not maneuver. The pass became a slaughterhouse. Xerxes watched in disbelief as wave after wave broke against the Greek line. His men were brave, but bravery meant nothing against discipline and geometry. The Spartans rotated their front ranks seamlessly, fresh men stepping forward to relieve the exhausted Persian dead piled high. The king's officers whipped their soldiers forward to keep them fighting, but even their whips could not push them through the wall of shields. By nightfall, the great king realized that what he faced was not madness, it was mastery. But arrogance is slow to learn. Xerxes still believed he could crush resistance through sheer numbers. On the second day, he sent in his elite force, the Immortals. 10,000 of the finest soldiers in the empire, clad in lamellar armor and armed with spears and bows. He was certain that the Immortals would succeed where others had failed. But when they entered the pass, they met the same fate. The Spartans had adapted their tactics overnight. They used feigned retreats to draw the Persians in, then turned and counterattacked in coordinated bursts. The Immortals, used to dominating their enemies with intimidation and numbers, found themselves trapped in close quarters where their curved swords and light armor were useless. Leonidas's men fought with short spears and Xiphos blades, weapons made for the press of the phalanx. Every inch the Persians gained cost them blood. As Xerxes looked down from his golden throne, he saw not a disciplined army faltering, but his own power unraveling. The Greeks were teaching him a lesson that no court advisor had dared to, that courage, guided by discipline, could make numbers irrelevant. Still, his pride would not let him retreat or rethink his approach. He was the king of kings, his will could not be defied. He ordered more attacks, convinced that the Greeks' strength must soon fail. The truth was that the Spartans' strength did not come from their muscles or their weapons, it came from their code. Every strike, every block, every death served a purpose. Their mother's words, "Return with your shield," or "on it," echoed in their minds. They were not fighting for survival. They were fighting to prove that devotion to duty could outlast fear itself. Xerxes, meanwhile, was driven by ego, not purpose. He measured victory in numbers and treasure, not in honor. That blindness kept him from understanding what he was truly facing. As the battle stretched into the third day, Xerxes grew furious. He had underestimated these men, and the humiliation burned. He had promised his empire an easy conquest, but now his army was being drained by a few thousand Greeks. It was only when a local Greek trader, Ephialtes, revealed a hidden mountain path that Xerxes finally gained an advantage. He sent his troops along the path to outflank Leonidas's position. Yet even when Leonidas learned of the betrayal, he did not retreat. He dismissed most of the allied Greeks, keeping only his Spartans and a few hundred Thespians and Thebans who chose to stay. Xerxes likely believed that Leonidas's decision was desperation. In reality, it was honor. The Spartans would not abandon the field. They would fulfill their code. When the Persians surrounded them from both sides, the Greeks fought with such ferocity that even the Persians began to hesitate. Spears shattered, shields splintered, but the line held until Leonidas fell. The Spartans fought over his body to prevent it from being taken, refusing to yield an inch of ground. Only when every man had fallen did the Persian army finally claim the pass. From his throne, Xerxes looked down upon the aftermath and saw victory, but a hollow one. He had lost thousands of soldiers to defeat a few hundred men. His army was demoralized. The Greeks had turned what should have been a simple conquest into a symbol of resistance. Xerxes had proven his power, but Leonidas had proven his immortality. In the days that followed, Xerxes ordered Leonidas's body to be mutilated and displayed a final act of spite, born of humiliation. But even this gesture could not erase what the Spartans had achieved. The story of their stand spread across Greece, igniting unity among rival city-states that had long despised each other. The arrogance of the Persian king had accomplished what no Greek diplomat ever could. It had forged a common cause. Xerxes believed that fear ruled all men. The Spartans showed him that conviction ruled stronger. He believed that numbers were destiny. They showed him that resolve could rewrite fate. In the narrow pass of Thermopylae, his arrogance met the limits of empire, and the world saw that even the mightiest king can be undone by misunderstanding the hearts of those who fight for something greater than themselves. The great king left Thermopylae with a path open to Greece, but not the victory he imagined. His army had won a battle, yet he had lost the illusion of divine certainty. His arrogance turned a tactical win into a spiritual defeat, and the words of Leonidas, silent in death, echoed louder than any Persian trumpet. The measure of a man and a nation is not found in how many follow him, but in what they stand for when all hope is gone. When the last Spartan fell, the silence that followed was heavier than any sound of battle. The pass at Thermopylae was nothing but ash, broken shields, and the twisted bodies of men who had refused to retreat. The Persians had won the field, but they hadn't conquered what mattered, because Leonidas and his 300 had turned their own deaths into the most powerful weapon of all an idea. The Spartans had been trained to die perfectly, but in doing so, they had done something even greater. They had turned death into propaganda, and that, more than any sword, would defeat an empire. Before we continue, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we uncover the real human genius behind the myths that shaped civilization. When the Persian army marched through the blood-soaked pass, they expected to crush Greek morale completely. Instead, they created a legend. Word of the stand at Thermopylae spread faster than any army could march. Messengers, refugees, and traders carried the story across the Aegean. The tale of 300 warriors who held back a 1,000,000-man army, who fought until the last spear broke, who died not for conquest, but for freedom. It was the kind of story that pierced straight into the heart of every Greek, no matter what city-state they belonged to. The Greeks at that time were not a unified people. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes were rivals constantly fighting, scheming, and trading insults. Their alliances were temporary, their loyalties fragile. But when they heard about Thermopylae, something ancient stirred in them, a sense of shared identity. The story of the 300 was not just about Sparta. It was about Greece itself, about a way of life that refused to kneel to tyranny. Leonidas had turned his small army into a symbol for all of Hellas, and that symbol was more powerful than any wall or weapon. Even the details of the story Leonidas' last words, the hopeless final charge, the pile of Persian bodies, were shaped and spread deliberately by the Greeks who survived. The accounts were told and retold, polished like a weapon of the mind. Every version emphasized courage over fear, freedom over submission. What the Persians saw as annihilation, the Greeks recast as immortality. In dying, the Spartans became more alive than ever before. In the imagination of the people, this transformation from defeat to legend was the real genius of Thermopylae. The Spartans had died at the perfect time, in the perfect place, witnessed by enough allies to ensure their story would travel. Leonidas may not have lived to see it, but his death was not an accident of war. It was a calculated move in the propaganda of freedom. He knew that a heroic death could do what no treaty or speech could unite the fractured Greek world under a single banner. And it worked. When the news reached Athens, it hit like lightning. The same people who once bickered over trade and territory suddenly felt the same pulse of defiance. Even the merchants and farmers who had never held a spear began to see the war not as a political matter, but as a personal one. Xerxes wasn't just invading a land, he was trying to erase a way of being. Thermopylae reminded every Greek what was at stake. The orators and poets took over where the swords had stopped. They turned the Spartan deaths into legend, weaving it into hymns, speeches, and public memory. The phrase, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws, we lie," was engraved on a stone at Thermopylae, message written not to mourn, but to recruit. It was a rallying cry. Across Greece, boys memorized it. Men repeated it before battle, and women whispered it to their sons. The dead Spartans became eternal soldiers, fighting in the minds of every living Greek. And as the Persians moved deeper into Greece, they began to feel the consequence of that legend. The Greeks no longer fought out of obligation, they fought with rage, with purpose, with the kind of clarity that comes only from loss turned into belief. Every arrow that flew, every oar that struck the sea, carried the memory of Leonidas' stand. At the Battle of Salamis, when Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into the narrow straits and annihilated it, the spirit of Thermopylae was there. At Plataea, when the Greek hoplites finally crushed the Persian ground forces, the ghost of the 300 stood beside them. The Persians had won the mountain pass, but they had lost the war for the soul of Greece. Xerxes had been right to fear what a symbol could do, because the death of a few hundred men had become a story too powerful to erase. The propaganda value of Thermopylae didn't stop in ancient times. It rippled forward through history, reshaping how the world understood courage. It turned sacrifice into strategy. The Romans studied it. The French revolutionaries quoted it. Modern armies invoke it. Thermopylae became the eternal blueprint for how a doomed stand could inspire impossible victories. It also revealed something uncomfortable about human psychology, that people are moved not by numbers, but by meaning. Xerxes' massive army, countless ships, and vast resources were meaningless next to the image of a single man standing his ground. The Greeks learned that stories outlive statistics, and the Spartans had written the greatest story of all, not about conquest, but about conviction. Leonidas had achieved in death what no general could achieve in life. His small, doomed stand redefined victory itself. It showed that the most powerful message a leader can send is not through survival, but through sacrifice. That by dying well, one can teach others how to live. And this is where the real brilliance of the Spartan legacy lies. It wasn't just that they fought bravely, it was that they understood how their bravery would be remembered. The Spartan education system, the agoge, didn't train boys to win. It trained them to die in a way that meant something. Leonidas embodied that lesson completely. His men didn't need a speech about honor. Their entire lives had prepared them for that moment to become the message itself. Thermopylae became more than a battle. It became a story about what it means to stand against the impossible. It was no longer about Persians and Greeks. It was about the eternal fight between freedom and domination, courage and fear, meaning and oblivion. Every civilization that came after borrowed from that myth because it spoke to something universal in the human heart. The Persians, despite their victory, were haunted by what they'd faced. It was defiance so complete that it turned defeat into immortality. He could burn cities, but he couldn't burn the idea those men had left behind. And that's why, in the end, Thermopylae was not a failure, it was a masterpiece of messaging. The Spartans taught the world that death, when embraced with purpose, can be the loudest cry of life. Their blood didn't sink into the earth quietly. It spoke. It told every Greek that tyranny can be resisted, that fear can be conquered, and that freedom is worth any cost. Even centuries later, the phrase "Molan labe, come and take them," still echoes. It's more than defiance. It's identity. It's the echo of a small group of men who chose to die perfectly so that others might live freely. So when we look at Thermopylae, we shouldn't just see a battlefield. We should see a Massaja deliberate, living piece of propaganda crafted through courage. Leonidas' death didn't end a war. It started a legend. A legend that built nations, inspired revolutions, and still reminds us that the loudest victories are sometimes the ones written in silence and blood. That was the true genius of the Spartans. Not that they fought without fear, but that they understood what their deaths would mean. They turned death into the ultimate message of life, and that's why, millennia later, we still talk about them, if you've made it this far. You've made it just far in Silence of Thermopylae and seen how death became a story more powerful than victory. To keep uncovering the hidden strategies behind history's greatest legends, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. Because history isn't just what happened,